I raise it because, yes, it is Labor Day weekend. And I think there are a number of rationales for why this is a holiday worth focusing on. Number one, it celebrates the idea of employees, and it celebrates the idea of labor. While I was working through this the entire week, I've also been engaged in dealing with people who are part of unions and organizers and trying to think through this idea of what does it mean to be a worker, and is there a theology to work? I've stood with workers, I've appreciated their stories, and it's been sort of pressing me in my heart to sort of think through why a holiday like this is significant and whether or not God has anything to say about it. I was especially moved by studying the life of a union worker named Cesar Chavez, who, as a Christian, decided that he would organize farmers and help develop what was called then the United Farm Workers Union. A man of Hispanic descent who recognized that migrant farm workers were being mistreated and decided to develop the National Farm Workers Association as a result of the faith that moved him in that direction. His formation of that union was located in his faith and his recognition that farm workers were being mistreated. You know, Yes We Can, as a relationship to the 2008 campaign of Barack Obama. Barack Obama took that title, that phrase, from Cesar Chavez, who said, yes, we can do it, long before Barack Obama thought about it. He was parroting a phrase from a migrant farm worker, a man of Hispanic descent, who recognized that there was something about labor and something about work that was not being understood, and decided to make a stand for people. Now, I thought about this because I wanted to know, where then is there this theological underpinning of what it means to be celebrating Labor Day, laborers and employees? And I thought, well, you're just doing that because politically it might be expedient. No. There's a rationale for why God says you and I need to be involved in these arenas. And when I thought about this, I couldn't help but recognize that anybody who claims to be Christian, who somehow cannot recognize that people who work with unfair contracts need somebody to stand with them. People who actually work with no contract need somebody to stand up for them. When you consider that the wage in America has not kept up with the cost of living, and there are still some people who have to beg, borrow, and steal in order to make ends meet. When you realize that the cost of living has not kept up with salaries, and that while some people are arguing for $15 an hour, if wages had remained consistent with the cost of living in this culture, the minimum wage would be about $23 an hour. When you realize that something is happening to our culture in that there has been an assault on the ethic of work, not just work. You see, because it used to be a time when it paid to work. But now in today's culture, it doesn't pay to work. This is why some people have 1, 2, and 3 jobs, and they still can't make ends meet. It's not because they're lazy, it's because something has happened in the culture that has left some people working hard and still getting nowhere. There should be no such thing, no such class as working poor. If you work, it should pay. And you wonder why there are some folks who turn to all kinds of nebulous lifestyles, like dealing drugs. And brothers, I need to tell you, if that's what you're doing, that's a poor career choice. But I at least understand that there was a time in this culture when if you worked and you got paid, it paid to work. That is no longer true. And the fact that you live in a culture where there is a class called working poor is a paradox, an oxymoron that makes absolutely no sense. If you work, you ought to be able to handle your business and sustain your family. So the question that I'm trying to raise is, not only is there a problem with this economically, there's a problem with this theologically. Not only is there a problem with this economically, there's a problem with this educationally. Because why should I go to college and embrace more than $100,000 worth of debt when I graduate, only to take a job that will not pay me what I'm properly supposed to be paid and spend the next 5 to 10 years in debt trying to pay back my college tuition loan? Somebody said, I wish you'd preach the Bible. I am. If you can't see that there's something wrong with that, then there's something wrong with you. Because there is something about the way God has designed the world to work that if you miss it, you'll not be moved to advocate and to speak for those muted voices who keep being burdened, and they need somebody to make a case. And the question becomes, well, what then are you working for? So you read the Genesis account, and what you know is that God planned work. You saw the creation story, you saw the development, and you saw that in verse 15, God had a man in the garden working and tilling the garden. And you are able to recognize that before the curse on work, work was a divine directive. It was God who instituted and created and planned work. It's a divine directive. God put the man in the garden, and it's a divine directive that God gave man before Adam sinned. Work came before sin and before the curse. Work came before sin and before the curse, which means work is not cursed. Work is a part of the divine directive. And I realize that a part of the struggle is that sometimes you and I can't see work as a divine design. But before Adam sinned and before there was a curse, God designed work. Now, your boss may not appreciate that. And some days you may not appreciate that. But you've got to tell yourself right now, henceforth and forevermore, that work is a good thing. I know you may not like your work, but you got to tell yourself that work is a good thing because God designed work. And if God designed it, the fact that man has messed it up doesn't mean it stops being good. And since God designed work, I am going to thank God for what he designed, even if I can't stand my boss. And your boss may never appreciate the work that you do. This is why I wanted you to look at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. Because whether or not your boss appreciates it, you've got to first of all embrace the reality that work is a divine design. And that why you and I go at this thing, we don't go at it necessarily to just be paid, although, word to the employers, they need to be paid well. You go at it because you realize at the end of the day, there's a fundamental formula for how your life and my life has been designed that you'll miss if you continue to not see work as God's divine design. You see, you keep breaking your life up you keep looking at your life with a line through it. And you see your life as sacred, and you see your life as secular. There are some things I do that are sacred. There are some things that I do that are secular. I would like to destroy that myth finally and fully this morning, because your life is not divided by a line of sacred and secular. Your life is a circle, which is why Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 says, whether you eat or whether you drink, he says, whatever you do, I want you to do it all to the glory of God. Your life is not divided by a line. Your life is within a circle. And everything you do in that circle, you do it for the glory of God. You say, Williams, there is no illegitimate bifurcation of secular and sacred? No. Because whether or not you are washing dishes or preaching the word, both are spiritual. One is not more spiritual than the other when your life is a circle. Whether you are changing a car tire or teaching a class, one is not more sacred and spiritual than the other. They are both within the circle called spiritual. Whether you are a grocery bagger or a banker, both are spiritual. And Paul says, whatever you do, no matter what your task, when you are involved in its formation, when you are involved in its execution, I want you to realize whether you're a janitor or a supervisor, you do it to the glory of God. You have to ask yourself, why did Paul take something as minuscule as eating and drinking and say, whether you eat or whether you drink, I want you to do it all for the glory of God? I'll tell you why. Because Paul realized that every single thing you do is done within the circle of the glory of God. And whether or not you are bussing tables, driving buses, or banking, every time you step into your role of worker, you are doing it to the glory of God. And you might have to do it with a mean-spirited supervisor, but at the end of the day, you're not working for them. You're working for the glory of God. Come on, I'm trying to make sense of this, because I realize that sometimes it's hard to keep working for people. It's hard to keep trying to do the impossible for the ungrateful. And it wears on you, because you realize you feel somehow underappreciated. But you have to know that your work is not by some nebulous esoteric force. Your work is by divine design. There's a source to work, because God created work before sin and before the curse, which means that work is a divine design. And when you realize whatever job you've got, you go into that task to give God glory and to give God honor. You realize you're not working for that man, you're working for the glory of somebody else. And what you also know is at the end of the day, if they don't pay right, you know he will. I'm not telling you anything I haven't had to live through. I used to have a gig, I won't tell you what it was, and I couldn't stand it. Come Monday morning, I had knots in my stomach, because I hated to go in. And one day it dawned on me, yo, you're not working for them. You're working for somebody else. And let me tell you why this is problematic. Because when you realize that all you do is spiritual, there is no sacred, secular divide, you stop working with this mentality that this is my secular stuff and this is my spiritual stuff. And you start to realize no matter where you are, you've been placed there by God to work for his ultimate glory. And then it changes the threat of who you work for. Because I know you know that God can find a number of resources to pay you. You think that the person's name on the bottom of your check is the person that's paying you. No, that's a resource. That ain't the source. God can use anybody to provide for you what he wants to provide for you. So you don't start fawning over the name on the bottom of your check, because at the end of the day, they really are not the people that are paying you. The person you really work for is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who said that the cattle on 1,000 hills, it belongs to me. And God can find ways to bless you even when your enemies come against you. And God can open doors that nobody can shut when you work as unto him. Do I have a witness anywhere? There's no sacred, no secular divide, which means that every single thing I do is supposed to produce the glory of God. You say, well, Williams, if I'm working because I realize he's the source, and I'm working because I realize the significance of my work to him, nothing I do is useless. I'm no longer working for what? And I realize it's not how I do what I do. It's who am I working for? And this is why, good people, when you show up late, when you call off and you ain't sick, when you sleep and you should be working, when you steal stuff that you know is not yours, when you cheat on the timesheet, what you do does not help. It hinders the glory of God. When you work, you're either helping the glory of God or you are hindering the glory of God. And when you are late, want to come late and leave early, know you get paid for 8, but would rather work 5. When you use up all of the company internet access, when most of the pens in your drawer have the company name on them, when you say, baby, don't worry about paper, you're not helping the glory. You're hindering the glory. Because see, the people watching you do your job, they know you claim to be a Christian. And they're watching your attitude, and they know you just as nasty and cantankerous as you can be. You don't want to submit to nobody, the manager, the supervisor, nobody can tell you anything. In fact, there are people on your job scared to talk to you because you're so ugly. They won't even talk to you because they're afraid if they say the wrong thing to you, you're going to go off. And you're the same one talking about the Lord is the Lord of your life. You love Jesus. Paul said, whether you eat or whether you drink, I want you to know that you do it all to the glory of God. And the question that you have to grapple with is, what really then am I working for? Now, in 1 Timothy 6, Paul is driving at this, and I don't want to take too much time this morning because it requires explanations that I don't have time to give. But when you're reading 1 Timothy 6, stop seeing the word slaves through the lens of the American experience. I realize that biblically illiterate and ignorant slave masters used that as a tool to keep slaves docile. But 1 Timothy 6 has to be understood in a cultural context in which slavery was more like employees working for employers. And when Paul is dealing with this issue in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he realizes that as the church is growing, there is within that church slaves, some former, some present. And so Paul is essentially trying to talk to people who were a part of an economic practice in Rome. Don't you go to sleep. I'm trying to help you. Inside Rome and inside the culture, there is an economic practice that is consistent with where they are culturally. And some slaves have come into the church. And Paul is trying to help these employees understand something about that work dynamic. He's trying to help them to recognize something that probably we could be helped by. Because what Paul goes after in 1 Timothy 6 is this idea that, number one, God has designed work. That's the Genesis 2 affiliation. He goes further in 1 Corinthians 10 and tries to help them to understand this idea of everything you do it to the glory of God. And by the time you hear him talking in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he's trying to say to these employees that the motivation for your work here is internal, not external. His encouragement to them is, as employees, he says, so that the name of God is not blasphemed. Because he realizes that as Christian men and women involved in this economic practice, as men and women who are employed, that if they are not careful, they will not help, they will hinder the gospel and the glory of God if they don't work as to the Lord. And I realize some people say, well, what motivates people to work? Well, some people work because they got to gratify their needs. Some people work because they need money. There's nothing wrong with that. And again, a word to employees, I think people ought to be paid well for their work. But if that doesn't become a reality quickly for you, you have to get up in the morning and you have to go work and realize that you do it as unto the Lord. And you may not be able to find the sweet spot of loving what you do. And when that happens, you will have to work because you know who you're working for, even if you don't like what you do. And what I've discovered about God is that sometimes when that heart is right towards God, God can bless you in ways that will simply blow your mind because you are involved in an enterprise and your desire is to bring him glory. He'll elevate you when you don't have the educational pedigree to support it. He'll promote you over your enemies. He'll make ways for you. And he'll open up those opportunities that are not even supposed to come to you. Why? Because when you are working for the glory of God, You say, well, then why does he put me in some hard situations? Because he's trying to see his glory. And sometimes the shine that's necessary to create the glory of God is not easily detected until some stuff is burned off. You say, well, why is it so hard in my life? Whether it's my work, it's because sometimes what God is doing is he's saying, I need you in this space. And the reason why I'm coming at you the way I'm coming at you is because I'm trying to see when you'll reflect my glory. And I know sometimes the flesh says speak, but God's spirit says don't say a word. Sometimes your flesh says fight, and the Spirit of God says relax. And there's always that war, that struggle of not understanding sometimes how far to go. It's at that moment where you have to ask yourself, well, what am I working for? And remind yourself that I'm working for a higher calling. It doesn't mean that I'll let people run over me. And let me offer a word before I sit down. When you know somebody is being run over and you don't speak up, you're as guilty as the person doing the running over. Stop going to work and pretending you don't see what's wrong, and when asked, pretending like you don't have a word about it. Because if it happens to them, you next. You better learn how to open your mouth for what you see is wrong and speak up, because there's a day coming when you're going to need somebody to speak on your behalf. I really don't know where Christians get this kind of passivity from, in which you believe it's more like Jesus to be passive. I read the Bible and I see somebody who will not capitulate to the status quo. But when he sees something that's wrong, he deals with it. He speaks up. And that's not just for those who somehow are being assaulted. Sometimes people can buy your silence. See, you think you got the gig you got, and you trying to hold on to it, so you operate out of a shut mouth posture. But the same people who elevate you are the same people who can knock you down, which is why you better let God raise you up. Because when God raises you up, you've been raised up sure enough. Do I have a witness? When God has worked to put you in a position, can't nobody mess with that. And these are the moments when you remind yourself of who you're working for, why you're working, and you recognize him as source. You recognize the significance of your work, and you recognize the motivation of your work that is not external, it is internal. Why? Because whether you eat or whether you drink, you do all for the glory of God. And I want you to go back to work on Tuesday with that in your head and in your heart. If you've been going in late, go in early. Don't arrive 10 minutes late. Show up 10 minutes early and become the most productive employee you can be. And when they ask you why, tell them it clearly ain't for the money. Let's just get that straight. I ain't doing this because y'all paying me so well. I'm doing it because I know somebody who's called me to be something in this culture. And I work as unto him. And I know that whatever is right at the end of the day, he's going to pay me. And I'm going to be glorified. Do I have a witness? That's the God you serve. That's the Christ we love.